Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and we are continuing the Friday the 13th series with the film from 1981, Friday the 13th, Part 2. Here is your trivia question for today. Other than Ginny and potentially Paul, what other counselor survives the movie? The answer will be at the end of this video. Our film starts off this time 2 months later after the events of the first movie. We are apparently catching up with Alice Hardy from the first film and seeing what she's up to. Unfortunately, what she's up to is being murdered by some maniac. We then jump ahead 5 years to 1984. It's here where we meet Paul Holt, who is running a school that is teaching people to become camp counselors. And of course, we meet all these would be counselors as well. We end up finding out that we're still on Crystal Lake, but the camp itself has actually been closed. So we're just nearby. We find out from Paul in the form of what seems like a ghost story that Mrs. Voorhees is the reason why the camp is closed. After she murdered a bunch of the camp counselors, she was decapitated herself. And now there's a rumor going around that her son Jason never actually drowned and he's out to get revenge for his mother. So our group of would-be camp counselors decide it's good to blow off some steam. So they go drink some alcohol and, of course, engage in some premarital sex, which is essentially ringing the dinner bell for a slasher flick. And wouldn't you know it, this does actually seem to summon this maniac from the beginning of the film back. And we do find out that it is, in fact, Jason, mainly due to the fact that he has a shrine to his dead mother. So, of course, he does try to continue his revenge quest by trying to mow down each and every one of these potential counselors. So, of course, the real question again becomes, will any of these individuals be able to survive this encounter? Director Sean S. Cunningham actually refused to come back for this sequel, as he did not like the concept of Jason coming back from the grave and thought it was stupid, and that it wouldn't work. Now, years later, he admits that he was very wrong about that. So, Steve Miner, who was actually an associate producer on the first film, moved into the director's chair for this one. Tom Savini, who was the makeup and special effects artist for the first film, also decided not to come back. One, because he also didn't like the idea of Jason being the killer, but two, he was actually working on a film at the time called The Burning. They would then bring in Stan Winston to take his place, but he also ended up having to leave, so they were finally able to get Carl Fullerton to take over. When they first started talking about making a second Friday the 13th movie, it was originally going to be an anthology horror based on the Friday the 13th superstitions. But due to the first film's popularity, they decided against that and continued going with the slasher series. Before deciding on just calling it Friday the 13th Part 2, the original working title was just called Jason. One of their first initial ideas was that they wanted to have a Laurie Strode Michael Myers situation with Alice Hardy and Jason. Now, this concept did not actually work out, and a lot of people think the reason for that is because Adrienne King was being stalked right after the first movie had come out, and that she requested not to be part of the second one. This actually wasn't true. Her agent actually asked for a much higher salary that the studio couldn't afford. So when she came in for her scenes, she didn't actually have a script or anything, and didn't have any idea that she was going to die immediately at the beginning of the film. The funny part is, when she came in for this scene, they notified her that they had actually already finished filming the rest of the movie. Now, when it comes to the portrayal of Jason in this film, he was definitely modeled after the killer from the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown. And the reason for this is they honestly couldn't come up with what they wanted to do for the mask and just kind of copied that. So when it comes to who actually played the character of Jason, there was quite a few people that did so in this movie. The majority of the actual scenes were done by Steve Dash. Now, in the original credits, it actually says that Warrington Gillette was Jason. The reason for this is he actually auditioned for the role of Paul, and when he didn't get it, they asked him to play Jason, but only for the sequences where you actually see Jason's face, and so in his contract, he actually had to be credited. Ellen Lutter also technically played Jason, very briefly though, as his legs for this one scene. Production assistant Jerry Wallace also briefly played Jason, and even head makeup artist Carl Fullerton also got in on the fun. It is believed that due to the way that Jason looks in the film, he more than likely is suffering from Proteus syndrome, which is the same one that Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, was afflicted with. Betsy Palmer reprised her role in a cameo as Mrs. Voorhees, but only agreed to it if the filming was not going to inconvenience her. So they offered to actually do her scenes in her own home. Now, an interesting rumor is supposedly Wes Craven actually shot these scenes for this film. Amy Steele plays the character of Ginny in the film, and the original plan was to actually have the character die, but the producers liked her so much that they even offered Steele a chance to replay the role in a third film. Now, unfortunately, her agent told her to turn it down. She has said in years later that she did regret that decision. Most, if not all, of the cast members actually stayed on site in the cabins during the filming. This film actually has one of the longest pre credit sequences in cinematic history. In some versions of the film, it is 18 minutes before the credits actually begin. The scene where Jason actually breaks through the window actually took 3 takes and a lot of bruises to get right. Now, of course, the part you've all been waiting for, the body count. With this film, technically there is a body count of 9 unless you count the dream sequence recap at the end. You have Alice Hardy, who is stabbed in the temple with an ice pick, Crazy Ralph, who is garroted with barbed wire, Deputy Winslow, who was hit in the back of the head with a hammer claw, Scott, who would have his throat slit with a machete, which is technically important as the machete is pretty much a signature weapon for Jason, and this is his first time wielding it. Then there's Mark, who gets a machete to the face, and also one of the worst and yet best moments, as his wheelchair just goes flying down a staircase. Then there is the duo of Jeff and Sandra, who both get killed at the same time as they are impaled with a spear through both of their bodies. Sandra, by the way, is a character that gets brought back up in part 4 as her brother is there to try to avenge her death. Then we have Vicky, who gets stabbed in the gut with a kitchen knife. And of course, there is Terry, who we don't really see what happens to her on screen, but we do see her body later in Jason's shack. Speaking of the bodies that are on the floor in Jason's shack, do you happen to know who all 3 of them are? Well, one of them is Terry, the other one is the police officer, and the last one you can actually tell is Alice's body, as even though it's decayed and old, you can see the ice pick that's still stuck in her head. Now, as I mentioned, there is some contention as to whether or not Paul is dead, as at the end there is that dream sequence that we don't really know whether or not it's true. There's also a little bit of Schrodinger's pets in this movie, because we're not exactly sure whether or not Muffin the dog or the cat from the beginning are also dead or alive. So when it comes to the film Friday the 13th Part 2, I do still enjoy this movie. I don't think it's as good as the first one, but I do really like that this, of course, is our first introduction to Jason Voorhees. But I don't know, there were some parts that were still a bit confusing or just didn't make sense at all. So I think I'm going to have to give this one a 3 out of 5. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, other than Ginny and potentially Paul, what other counselor survives the movie? So the other surviving counselor is Ted. He was extremely lucky as he decided to stay at the bar and ended up seeing none of the violence from that night. Now, the character of Ted is played by Stuart Charno, who actually originally auditioned for both the roles of Paul and Mark. When he didn't get either one of those, though, they kept him on as the character of Ted. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.